Picture this. A 10-year-old boy who's never spoken a word in his life, standing by a fountain in his billionaire father's estate, about to hear sound for the very first time. And the person who makes that miracle happen? Not a world-renowned surgeon, not a million-dollar specialist. A maid named Lila, with trembling hands and a hairpin sterilized in alcohol. The moment she pulls that dark, segmented creature from Rowan's ear canal, chitin legs still twitching, still wet, everything changes. The fountain that's been running for years suddenly hisses. Footsteps on marble scrape. And Rowan, eyes wide with shock and wonder, looks at the woman who freed him and whispers his first word. Lila. His father, Victor Langford, a man who spent millions chasing a cure, stands frozen, caught between awe and accusation. What did you do to my son? But here's the thing. Lila didn't hurt him. She saved him from a medical system that missed the signs, from specialists too prestigious to look closely enough, from a decade of silence that should never have been. This is a true story about courage, about what happens when money can't buy the answer but attention can find it, and about a house that learned the difference between quiet and peace. Stay until the end, because the courtroom battles, the hospital cover-ups, and the final word Rowan speaks to his father will leave you in tears, the good kind. If you are hooked and ready to enjoy this thrilling story, I want you to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comment what time and country you are watching from. I want to see how far this beautiful story travels. Now, let us continue. The Langford estate was a place where even silence had a price tag. Every surface gleamed. Every chandelier caught light like a promise kept. Yet beneath the polish lived an emptiness no amount of money could fill. Staff moved through hallways on muffled carpets, their steps erased before they could echo. They said Mr. Victor Langford preferred it that way. Control measured in decibels, power wrapped in hush. Victor was a man built for certainty. His world ran on schedules, offshore bids, and contracts that reshaped skylines. But behind the sharp suits and steady handshakes was a father who hadn't slept through the night in 10 years. His only son, Rowan, had been born deaf, or so every specialist, every scan, every invoice insisted. Victor had spent a decade flying to foreign clinics, hiring the brightest minds medicine could offer, chasing hope across 3 continents. Each time, he returned home to the same soundless rooms, the same unanswered prayers. Rowan was 10 now. He had never heard rain tap against glass, never heard his father's voice crack with worry, never heard his own laughter. The only sounds he knew were the ones he saw on people's lips when they spoke, shapes without music, words without weight. Sometimes he would sit by the courtyard fountain and press his palm flat against the stone basin, trying to feel what he could not hear, as a vibration alone could teach him the language of the world. The mansion staff had learned to communicate with him through careful gestures and patient repetition, though most barely tried. Some pitied him. Others feared him, as if his silence carried a curse that might spread. But one person looked at him differently. Her name was Lila Duarte. Lila was new to the Langford estate, a young woman in her late 20s who arrived with a rolling cart, bottles of lemon oil, and a quiet that felt different from the mansion's engineered hush. She wore the same mustard and blue uniform every day, washed carefully by hand each night, and tied her dark hair in a neat bun that never came loose, even during the longest shifts. She worked without complaint, never gossiping, never lingering. But beneath her steady exterior lived a heart scarred by a loss she could never undo. Lila once had a younger cousin named Mateo. He had lost his hearing after an ear infection when they were children, an infection the free clinic dismissed as swimmer's ear because Lila's aunt couldn't afford the follow-up. She remembered the helpless look on her aunt's face. She remembered Mateo pressing his small hands to his temples, signing bug over and over, and no one listening. She remembered the fever that came 3 days later and the silence that followed. Since then, Lila carried a folded obituary behind her ID badge, the paper worn soft from years of being moved from pocket to pocket. And she carried a vow. If I ever meet another child like him, I will never look away. The first time Lila saw Rowan, he was sitting on the marble staircase, arranging smooth stones in a perfect line by weight and color. He didn't look up when she passed, but she noticed something about him that others missed. He didn't move like most children. He was too careful, too still, his dark eyes holding a loneliness she recognized bone deep. From that day forward, Lila began leaving small things for him on the steps. A folded paper bird, a chocolate wrapped in gold foil, a note with a hand-drawn sun. At first, Rowan ignored them, but one morning, she found the chocolate gone and the paper birds arranged beside his stones. Slowly, something shifted. When Lila cleaned windows near his playroom, he would come close, watching her reflection in the glass. She would smile and wave. He started waving back. When she accidentally dropped a cup once, he laughed, silently, holding his stomach with both hands, and it was the first time anyone in the mansion had seen him smile in months. Day by day, Lila became the only person Rowan trusted. She taught him small hand signs. He taught her how to see joy in things others overlooked. She didn't treat him like a patient or a tragedy. She treated him like a boy who deserved to be heard, even if the world had given up listening. But not everyone approved. One evening, while Lila was wiping down the long dining table, the estate manager, a man named Anders Cole, with polished manners and colder priorities, appeared at her elbow. "You should keep your distance," he said quietly, his tone sharp beneath the courtesy. "Mr. Langford doesn't like the staff getting too close to his son." Lila looked up, startled, but he seems happier. "That's not your concern," Anders cut her off. "You're here to clean, not to bond." Lila said nothing, but her heart disagreed. She knew what loneliness looked like. She had seen it in Mateo's eyes the week before he died, and she saw it now every time Rowan sat alone by the fountain, pressing his hands to stone as if it might answer him. That night, while the rest of the staff retreated to their quarters, Lila sat by the small kitchen window, listening to the wall clock tick in the dark. She thought of Mateo, how no one had cared enough to notice his pain until it was too late. She couldn't let that happen again. The next morning, she found Rowan sitting in the garden, scratching at his ear and wincing. His small face was tight with discomfort. Lila knelt beside him, her pulse quickening. She signed gently, "Are you okay?" He shook his head. She leaned closer, tilting his head just slightly toward the sunlight. The light fell across his ear canal, and for a heartbeat, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Deep inside, past a visible bend, something dark glistened. Something moved. Lila blinked hard, unsure whether to trust her own eyes. It looked like a shadow with joints, wet and segmented, but surely she was mistaken. She didn't touch him. She smiled softly and signed, "Let's tell your father." "Okay." Rowan's hands flew up in sharp, panic motions. No doctors. His eyes filled with fear, and he signed again, trembling. "They hurt me." Lila froze. In that moment, she understood everything. He wasn't just uncomfortable with hospitals. He was terrified, scarred by a decade of invasive tests, cold instruments, and promises that led nowhere. That night, she couldn't sleep. The image of that dark thing inside his ear haunted her. What if it's serious? What if it's the reason he's never heard? She thought of calling someone, but then remembered how the Langford estate worked. Without Victor's approval, no door opened, and Victor barely acknowledged her existence. The unease grew worse the next day. Rowan kept touching his ear, tears pooling in the corners of his eyes. Lila followed him into the playroom, her heart pounding. She didn't know what to do, but she couldn't ignore it any longer. She whispered to herself, "Lord, guide me, please." When Rowan winced again, hard enough that a tear slipped down his cheek, Lila made a choice that would change everything. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small hairpin she used to secure her bun. She sterilized it quickly in a cap full of rubbing alcohol she kept for cleaning cuts, then knelt beside him. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice steady even though her hands were not. "I'll help you." And at that exact moment, as her trembling fingers moved toward his ear, the playroom door creaked open behind her. Someone was watching. The playroom door swung open, slow and deliberate, and Victor Langford stepped inside. His footsteps were silent on the thick carpet, but his presence filled the space like a dropped stone fills water, displacing everything around it. Lila's hand froze inches from Rowan's ear, the hairpin still wet with alcohol, catching light like a silver needle suspended in air. Her pulse hammered in her throat. "He'll fire me. He'll call security. He'll take Rowan away. Step back. Victor's voice was low, controlled, the kind of calm that comes before thunder. Lila met his eyes. Sir, please. There's something in his ear. Something living. I saw it move. Victor's jaw tightened. I've had specialists from Geneva to Singapore examine my son. Are you telling me a housekeeper, see what they couldn't? I'm telling you he's in pain. Lila said quietly, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. And I know what it looks like when no one listens. Rowan sat between them, small and still, his dark eyes moving from his father to Lila and back. His hand was pressed against his ear. Fingers curled tight, and tears, silent, stubborn tears, slipped down his cheeks. Victor saw them, his son's tears. The same tears he'd watched fall 1,000 times over a decade, helpless and furious and exhausted in equal measure. One chance. Victor said finally, the words rough, if you hurt him. I won't. Lila knelt again, her knees pressing into the carpet, and reached for Rowan's face with both hands. She tapped her sternum twice. Steady, steady, and Rowan, after a long breath, mirrored the gesture. Victor stood behind them, arms crossed, every muscle coiled, watching. Lila tilted Rowan's head gently toward the window, letting the late morning light pour directly into canal. There, just past the visible curve, deep where shadow pooled, something dark and segmented glistened. It twitched. Her breath caught. Not a shadow. Not debris. Alive. She whispered, barely audible, Jesus, help me. With her left hand, she steadied Rowan's jaw, thumb soft against his cheek. With her right, she held the hairpin like a surgeon holds a scalpel, firm, deliberate, no room for hesitation. Look at me, baby. Just keep looking at me. Rowan's eyes locked onto hers. Wide, trusting, terrified. Lila slid the pin along the outer wall of the canal, millimeter by millimeter, until the tip made contact with something hard and smooth, chitin. The creature flinched. Rowan gasped, a sharp intake through his nose, but didn't pull away. Easy, Lila murmured. Almost there. She angled the pin beneath the ridge of the creature's body and pulled. Steady, not fast, drawing it toward the light. Resistance. A sickening, slick give. Legs unhooking from soft tissue. Victor stepped closer, his breath audible now. What is that? Lila didn't answer. Couldn't. Every ounce of her focus was on the slow, terrible extraction, on keeping her hand from shaking, on reading Rowan's eyes for pain. And then, all at once, it came free. The creature landed in Lila's palm, a segmented arthropod, dark brown and wet, its legs still twitching against her skin. She held it up to the light, her chest heaving, and for one frozen heartbeat, no one moved. Then Rowan gasped again, but this time it was different. His head snapped toward the courtyard doors. His eyes went wide, not with fear, but with shock. The fountain outside was running, as it always had, water spilling over smooth stone in a soft, endless rhythm. But Rowan had never heard it before. Now he did. He flinched, covered his ears with both hands. His mouth opened in a silent cry. Rowan! Victor dropped to his knees beside his son, hands hovering, uncertain. Rowan, what's wrong? But Lila understood. She reached out and touched Rowan's wrist gently, guiding his hands down. It's okay, she whispered. That's the fountain. You're hearing it. Sweetheart, you're hearing. Rowan's chest rose and fell in rapid bursts. His eyes darted toward the fountain, toward the door where his state manager Anders stood frozen in the hallway, shoes squeaking faintly on marble, toward his father's ragged breathing. And then Rowan's lips moved, shaped a sound, a word. Lila. Victor's hand flew to his mouth. His eyes flooded. Lila. Rowan said again, clearer now, raw and hoarse but real, and he reached for her with both arms, trembling. She pulled him close, pressing his head to her shoulder, and whispered into his hair, I hear you, baby. I hear you. Anders stepped fully into the doorway, his face pale, his polished demeanor cracked. Mr. Langford. Should I call security? She touched. Shut up. Victor's voice was a blade. He didn't look away from his son. Rowan pulled back from Lila's shoulder and turned to face his father. His mouth opened again, testing the shapes, the vibrations traveling up his throat for the first time in his life. "Dad." Victor's knees buckled. He caught himself with one hand on the carpet, staring at Rowan as if his son had just spoken a language extinct for centuries. "No," he whispered. That's not possible." But it was. And the impossibility of it. The fact that a maid with a hairpin had done what millions of dollars and a decade of experts could not, broke something inside Victor Langford. Something old and calcified and proud. He looked at Lila, still kneeling on the floor with the creature in her palm, and his expression twisted between awe and fury, gratitude and accusation. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "How did you? Why didn't anyone?" He couldn't finish. His hands shook. "I looked," Lila said simply. "I just looked." Anders recovered first, pulling his phone from his pocket. "I'm calling an ambulance. We need medical personnel to assess." "Do it," Victor said, still staring at Rowan, who was now touching his own throat with fascinated, trembling fingers. The next 30 minutes blurred into chaos. Paramedics arrived, crisp and efficient, checking Rowan's vitals while he flinched at the beep of the blood pressure cuff, the snap of a latex glove. Lila tried to explain, showed them the creature, still twitching faintly in a clear specimen cup, but they were focused on protocol. Airway, breathing, circulation, scene safety, transport authorization. Victor signed the forms with shaking hands. Anders hovered, murmuring into his own phone about discretion and controlling the narrative. At the ambulance doors, as they loaded Rowan onto the stretcher, the boy reached out, signing frantically. Lila, stay. I'm coming," Lila said, stepping forward. Anders caught her elbow. "Mr. Langford and his son need privacy. You've done enough." Victor stood at the rear of the ambulance, one hand braced against the door frame. He looked back at Lila, really looked at her, and for a moment, something softened in his face. "Thank you," he said quietly. Then he climbed inside, and the doors swung shut. Lila stood on the driveway, alone, as the ambulance pulled away, siren silent, but lights flashing red and white against the mansion's perfect glass walls. Anders released her arm. "Clean the playroom," he said coldly. "Then wait in the staff quarters. Mr. Langford will decide what happens next." She nodded numb and walked back inside, still holding the specimen cup with its dark, impossible truth. At the hospital, the intake team swarmed, clipboards, consent forms, wires snaking from monitors to Rowan's small chest. Dr. Halverson, the lead Yeni specialist who had consulted on Rowan's case for years, arrived with a tight smile and a notebook already filled with careful hedges. Restored auditory response may be transient canal irritation presenting as apparent threshold shift, requires extensive follow-up to rule out psychosomatic factors. Victor sat beside Rowan's bed, holding his son's hand, listening to the words pile up like sandbags against a flood. And in the hallway outside, a young audiology resident named Dr. Patel paused at a computer terminal, pulling up Rowan Langford's file. She scrolled back, years back, past the polished reports and prestigious consultations. There, buried in a subfolder marked pending review, low priority, she found it. A 3-year-old memo flagged by a junior technician during a routine scan. The note read, "A typical canal shadow, right ear. Foreign body not excluded. Recommend follow-up imaging." Beneath it, an email thread, "Patient classified VIP. Avoid alarm. Monitor via existing protocol. Sponsorship liaison requests continuity of care team." Dr. Patel's hands went cold. She printed the pages, folded them carefully, and slipped them into her pocket. When her shift ended 2 hours later, she found Lila Duarte sitting alone in the hospital cafeteria, still in her mustard-yellow uniform, clutching a cup of cold coffee. "You're the one who found it," Dr. Patel said quietly, sitting down across from her. Lila looked up, startled. Yes. Is Rowan okay?" "He's stable. He's hearing. He's—" Dr. Patel paused. "He's a miracle." Lila's eyes filled. "Thank God." Dr. Patel slid the folded papers across the table. "You should see these." And so should his father. Lila unfolded them. "Read the memo, the email thread, the dates." Her hands began to shake. "They knew," she whispered. "They suspected," Dr. Patel corrected. "And they buried it." Lila looked up, tears streaming now, and her voice when she spoke was quiet but edged with iron. "He needs to see this. Right now." Rowan's hospital room was too bright, too white, filled with the soft beeping of machines and the sterile smell of disinfectant. He sat propped against pillows, eyes wide and darting, tracking every click of a pen, every rustle of paper, every squeak of rubber soles on linoleum. Victor sat beside him, one hand wrapped around his son's smaller one, the other gripping the armrest hard enough that his knuckles had gone pale. Dr. Halverson stood at the foot of the bed, tablet in hand, his voice smooth and measured, the kind of voice that had calmed anxious parents in consultation rooms across 3 continents. "What we're seeing is remarkable, Mr. Langford. Truly remarkable." He tapped the screen, pulling up a fresh audiogram. Rowan is demonstrating auditory threshold responses across multiple frequencies. However, Victor's voice was sharp. Dr. Halverson smiled, a practiced gesture of reassurance. "We must be cautious. Canal irritation from foreign body removal can create temporary sensitivity that mimics genuine auditory processing. We've seen cases where initial response diminishes over time as inflammation resolves." He spoke. Victor said flatly, "He said my name. He said her name." Speech production doesn't always correlate with sustained auditory comprehension, Dr. Halverson continued, his tone never wavering. "We'll need extensive follow-up, serial audiometry, speech-language evaluation, possibly neurological consultation to rule out psychosomatic factors." "Psychosomatic?" Victor stood, his chair scraping backward. "My son had a living creature lodged in his ear canal for God knows how long, and you're suggesting he's imagining sound." Dr. Halverson raised a placating hand. "I'm suggesting we proceed with appropriate medical caution. Rowan's case has been extensively documented. Sudden, dramatic shifts in baseline function require rigorous verification before we alter his care plan." Rowan tugged his father's sleeve. When Victor looked down, his son was signing, scared, loud. Victor's expression softened. He sat back down, pulling Rowan close. "It's okay. You're safe." But even as he said it, something cold and sharp settled in his chest. Extensive documentation, care plan, verification, words that sounded like medicine but felt like walls. The cafeteria had emptied for the night. Only a few overhead lights remained on, casting long shadows across the scuffed tile floor. Lila sat at a corner table, the folded papers Dr. Patel had given her spread out in front of her like evidence at a crime scene. She'd read them 3 times now. Each time, the words cut deeper. A typical canal shadow, right ear, foreign body not excluded. Dated 3 years ago. Flagged by a junior technician named M. Torres during a routine imaging session. And beneath it, the email chain. From Dr. J. Halverson to Administrative Liaison, VIP Services Re. Langford R. Imaging follow-up. Patient classified VIP. Recommend we avoid alarming language in reports. Father has expressed frustration with inconclusive findings in the past. Suggests we monitor via existing protocol rather than introduce new variables. Sponsorship Liaison has also requested continuity of care team to maintain relationship integrity. From Administrative Liaison to Dr. J. Halverson. Agreed. Flag memo moved to pending review, low priority. We'll advise Torres accordingly. Let's keep the narrative stable. Lila's hands trembled as she traced the words with her finger. Keep the narrative stable. Not keep the child safe. Not investigate immediately. Stable. Profitable. Predictable. The cafeteria door swung open. Lila looked up, startled, to see Victor Langford standing in the doorway, his tie loosened, his face haggard. "They told me you were here," he said quietly. He crossed the room slowly, as if each step required permission. "May I sit?" Lila nodded, her throat tight. Victor sat across from her, his eyes falling immediately to the papers spread across the table. "What is that?" Lila slid them toward him without a word. Victor read. His jaw tightened. His breathing changed, shallow, sharp. When he reached the email chain, his hand clenched into a fist, crumpling the edge of the page. 3 years, he whispered. They knew 3 years ago. They suspected, Lila said softly, and they chose not to look. Victor's eyes lifted to meet hers, and she saw something she hadn't expected. Not anger, but anguish. Raw, unguarded pain. "I trusted them," he said, his voice breaking. "I paid them. I gave them everything, access, resources, my time, my faith, and they let my son suffer because it was easier to keep billing me than to find the truth." Lila reached across the table and placed her hand gently over his. "You didn't know. I should have known." Victor pulled his hand back, pressing his palms against his eyes. "I built an empire on reading contracts, on seeing through doublespeak, on knowing when someone is selling me a story instead of a solution. And I missed this. I missed it for 10 years. You trusted the system," Lila said. "That's not a failure. That's human." Victor lowered his hands. His eyes were red, but his voice when he spoke next was edged with something harder than grief. "Who else knows about this?" "Just Dr. Patel, the resident who gave it to me." "Where is she now?" "Her shift ended. She went home." Victor stood, pulling his phone from his pocket. "I need her contact information, and I need Anders." Lila blinked. "Your estate manager?" "He was the one who recommended Dr. Halverson," Victor said, his voice flat. "He handled all the medical referrals. Told me Halverson was the best in the field. Said we needed to stay within brand name care to protect Rowan's privacy." Lila felt ice settle in her stomach. "Do you think he knew?" Victor's silence was answer enough. By the time Anders arrived at the hospital, it was nearly midnight. He stepped into private conference room Victor had commandeered with his usual polished composure. Tailored suit, calm expression, hands folded neatly in front of him. "Mr. Langford, I came as soon as I received your message. How is Rowan?" Victor didn't answer. He slid a folder across the table. "Sit down and read." Anders glanced at Lila, who stood near the window, arms crossed. His expression flickered, surprise, then wariness. But he sat and opened the folder. Victor watched him read, watched his eyes move across the memo, the email chain, the dates. Watched for the moment recognition hit. It came halfway down the second page. Anders' jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He closed the folder and set it down carefully. "This is unfortunate," he said evenly, "but not uncommon. Medical institutions prioritize risk management. It's standard practice to..." "Standard practice?" Victor's voice was dangerously quiet. "To bury a memo that could have diagnosed my son 3 years ago." To avoid unnecessary alarm, Anders corrected. "The memo was speculative. Not excluded isn't the same as confirmed. Dr. Halverson made a reasonable clinical judgment. Dr. Halverson made a profitable judgment." Victor cut him off. "Rowan's case brought sponsorship money, gala appearances, PR opportunities. And you..." He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Anders. "You made sure I stayed inside that system. You steered every referral. You vetted every consultant. You told me who to trust." Anders' calm cracked, just slightly. "I acted in your family's best interest." "You acted in your best interest," Victor said coldly. "How much did Halverson's network pay you to keep me as a patient? How many consultation fees did you collect for maintaining the referral pipeline?" Anders stood. "I don't have to listen to baseless accusations." "Sit down." The command in Victor's voice was absolute. Anders hesitated, then slowly sank back into his chair. Victor opened his own phone and pulled up a screen. "I spent the last hour with my legal team. They subpoenaed your financial records, your correspondence with the hospital's administrative liaison, and every contract you signed on my behalf." He turned the phone toward Anders. "This is an email you sent 4 years ago to Dr. Halverson's office. Subject line, Langford retention strategy. Would you like me to read it aloud?" Anders' face went pale. "You're fired," Victor said simply. "Security will escort you from the premises. If you attempt to contact anyone associated with my family or my business, I will pursue criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy to commit medical negligence." Anders opened his mouth, closed it, then stood on shaking legs. He looked at Lila, his expression somewhere between fury and desperation. "She's a maid. You're destroying your reputation over a maid's word." "She saved my son," Victor said, his voice like steel. "You helped bury him. Get out." Anders left without another word, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that echoed through the small room. Lila exhaled slowly, her hands still trembling. "What happens now?" Victor looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something like humility in his face. "Now," he said, "we make sure this never happens to another child." The hospital board met in an emergency session at 8 a.m. the following morning. 6 administrators, 3 senior physicians, 2 legal advisors, and Dr. Halverson himself, seated at the far end of a long mahogany table. Victor entered with Lila at his side, and Dr. Patel trailing behind them, a box of files in her arms. "Mr. Langford," the board chair began, rising with an extended hand. "We're so pleased to hear about Rowan's progress. If you'd like to discuss follow-up care." "Sit down," Victor said. He didn't shake the man's hand. The chair sat. Victor placed a folder on the table and opened it. "For the past 10 years, I have paid this institution millions of dollars for consultations, diagnostics, therapies, and expert opinions. I was told my son's deafness was congenital, permanent, untreatable." He slid the first document across the table. "This is a memo dated 3 years ago, flagged by one of your own technicians, indicating a possible foreign body in my son's ear canal." Silence. Victor slid the second document. "This is an email from Dr. Halverson to your administrative liaison, requesting that the memo be deprioritized to avoid alarming language and maintain relationship integrity." Dr. Halverson shifted in his seat. That language was taken out of context. Victor's eyes snapped to him. "Then provide the context." Halverson opened his mouth, then closed it. Victor slid a third document. "This is a billing audit showing that Rowan's case generated over $400,000 annually in consultation fees, therapy sessions, and experimental treatment protocols, all coded under a permanent impairment designation." One of the legal advisors cleared her throat. "Mr. Langford, I understand you're upset, but medical decision-making is complex. Hindsight—" "This isn't hindsight," Victor interrupted. "This is negligence. Willful, profitable negligence." He looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes in turn. "I want every member of this board to read these documents aloud. I want the dates. I want the names. I want you to hear how you failed my son." The room was silent. "Start with you," Victor said, nodding to the board chair. The man hesitated, then picked up the first page. His voice shook as he read. "A typical canal shadow, right ear, foreign body not excluded. Recommend follow-up imaging." Victor nodded. Next, one by one, they read the memo, the emails, the billing codes, the audit trail that showed how a child's suffering had been monetized, managed, and buried beneath layers of polished language and institutional inertia. By the time they finished, 2 of the administrators had tears in their eyes. Dr. Halverson sat rigid, staring at the table. Victor stood. "I'm filing a formal complaint with the state medical board. I'm also funding an independent audit of every pediatric case this institution has handled in the last decade. And I'm establishing a foundation," he glanced at Lila, "with Ms. Duarte as clinical outreach lead, to train non-specialist caregivers in early detection protocols for conditions that systems like yours are incentivized to overlook." The board chair rose, his face ashen. "Mr. Langford, if we could discuss a settlement." "No settlement," Victor said flatly. "No non-disclosure agreement. No quiet resolution. You want to control the narrative?" He gestured to the documents scattered across the table. "The narrative is this: you failed. Publicly. Completely. And a maid with a hairpin did what all of you refused to do. She looked." He turned to Lila. Let's go." As they walked toward the door, Dr. Patel followed. At the threshold, Victor paused and looked back at the board one last time. "My son's first word was Lila," he said quietly. "Not Dad. Not help. Her name, because she was the only one who saw him." He let the door close behind them. Outside, in the hospital parking lot, the morning sun was bright and unforgiving. Lila stood beside Victor's car, still trembling from the confrontation, her mind reeling. Victor turned to her. "I owe you more than gratitude," he said. "I owe you trust, and I owe you the truth." Lila looked up at him, confused. "What truth?" "That I almost fired you yesterday," Victor admitted. "That I almost had you arrested for touching my son without permission. That I was ready to protect my pride and my system and everything I'd built, even if it meant silencing the one person who actually helped him." Lila's eyes filled. "But you didn't." "Because Rowan said your name," Victor said, his voice breaking. "And in that moment, I realized he'd been trying to tell me for years who I should trust. I just wasn't listening." He extended his hand. "Will you help me build something better? Not as an employee, as a partner." Lila stared at his hand, then took it. "Yes," she whispered. "For Rowan, and for every child like him." Victor nodded. "Then let's go home. We have work to do." The press conference was scheduled for 2 p.m. in the main lobby of Langford Tower, Victor's flagship office building in downtown Chicago. By 1:45, the space was packed. Cameras, reporters, microphones clustered like a metal forest across the marble floor. Victor stood backstage, adjusting his tie for the third time. Beside him, Lila smoothed her hands down the front of her dress, a simple navy sheath she'd borrowed from Dr. Patel, since her uniform was still folded in her locker at the estate. "You don't have to do this," Victor said quietly. "I can handle questions." Lila shook her head. "If we're to change how people see this, really see it, they need to hear from someone who's been where these families are, someone who knows what it's like to be invisible." Victor studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you." At precisely 2 o'clock, they walked out together. The camera shutters erupted like a rainstorm. Victor stepped to the podium. The room quieted. 10 days ago, he began, his voice steady but stripped of its usual corporate polish. "My son Rowan spoke his first word. He is 10 years old. For his entire life, every specialist I consulted told me he was profoundly deaf, that his condition was congenital, permanent, and untreatable." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. They were wrong. Not because the science failed, not because the technology wasn't advanced enough, but because the system prioritized profit over truth and comfort over care. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Victor gestured to Lila. "Ms. Lila Duarte, a member of my household staff, discovered a living foreign body lodged in my son's ear canal. She removed it with sterilized hairpin and gave my son something millions of dollars could not: his hearing." The cameras swung toward Lila. She stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," she said softly. "I just looked, and I listened, not to reports or specialists, but to Rowan. He told me, in his own way, that he was in pain. I just chose to believe him." A reporter raised her hand. "Ms. Duarte, what made you think you could do what trained medical professionals couldn't?" Lila's eyes filled, but her voice didn't waver. "Because I lost someone the same way. My cousin. The clinic said it was nothing serious. By the time anyone looked closely, it was too late." She took a breath. "I promised myself I'd never let that happen again to another child. Not if I could help it." Victor placed a hand on the podium. "Today, I'm announcing the creation of the Open Ear Initiative, a foundation dedicated to training non-specialist caregivers in early detection protocols for conditions that traditional systems are incentivized to overlook." He clicked a remote, and a presentation appeared on the screens behind him. Images of training kits, red flag checklists, community screening programs. "We're partnering with rural clinics, schools, and community health workers to ensure that the people who spend the most time with children, parents, teachers, aides, have the tools to spot warning signs early. Ms. Duarte will serve as our clinical outreach lead, designing protocols based on her lived experience and the insight she's gained. Another reporter stood. Mr. Langford, are you planning legal action against the hospital? Victor's expression hardened. I've filed a formal complaint with the state medical board. An independent audit is underway. But my focus isn't revenge, it's reform. I want systemic change. And I want every family to know that sometimes the most qualified person to help your child isn't the one with the most degrees. It's the one who refuses to look away. He turned to Lila and, in front of the entire room, extended his hand. She took it, and he said clearly for the cameras and the record, Ms. Duarte saved my son, and now, together, we're going to help save others. The room erupted in applause. The Langford estate looked different when they returned 3 days later. The thick sound-dampening carpets had been rolled up and removed, exposing the original hardwood floors, oak planks that clicked under heels and creaked near the staircase. The windows, once sealed and layered with acoustic glass, had been replaced with standard panes that let in not just light, but noise, birdsong, distant traffic, the rustle of wind through the hedge maze. Rowan stood in the foyer, eyes wide, turning in slow circles as if the house had transformed into a foreign country. Listen, Lila said, kneeling beside him. She tapped a knuckle against the floor. The sound rang out, sharp and clear. Rowan's face lit up. He dropped his knees and knocked his own knuckles against the wood. Once, twice, 3 times, giggling at the echo. Victor watched from the doorway, his tie loosened, his jacket draped over one arm. He looked like a man who'd just stepped out of a stranger's life and into his own. Come see the music room, he said, his voice tentative. I had them open the piano. Rowan looked up, signing, piano? Victor nodded. He led them down the hall to a room that had been locked for years, a space filled with grand pianos shrouded in dust covers and silence. Now the covers were gone. The lid was propped open. Sunlight poured through the tall windows. Lila lifted Rowan onto the bench. He stared at the keys, hesitant, then pressed one, middle C. The note rang out, pure and bright. Rowan gasped, then pressed again. And then he started pressing other keys, random and chaotic and joyful, filling the room with sound. Victor sat down beside his son, his throat tight. You want to try something? He asked. Rowan nodded. Victor placed Rowan's small hand over his own and played a simple melody. 3 notes, repeated. Then he lifted his hand and let Rowan try alone. Rowan stumbled through it, missed a key, laughed, and tried again. Lila stood by the window, tears streaming down her face, and whispered, Thank you, God. That evening after dinner, a meal eaten without the usual silence, filled instead with the clatter of forks and the scrape of chairs. Victor found Lila in the kitchen, washing dishes by hand, even though the staff had returned. You don't have to do that, he said. Lila smiled. Old habits. Victor picked up a towel and started drying. They worked in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the quiet splash of water and the clink of porcelain. I need to apologize, Victor said finally. Lila glanced at him. For what? For almost having you arrested, for not trusting you, for building a world so insulated that I couldn't see my own son's pain. His hand still on the plate. For 10 years, I thought I was protecting him. I was just hiding. Lila set down the sponge and turned to face him. You didn't know how to help him. That's not the same as not loving him. But you knew, Victor said. You saw him. Really saw him. How? Lila looked down at her hands, still wet with soap. Because no one saw my cousin. And I know what it costs when people look past you instead of at you. Victor was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, Will you teach me? Teach you what? How to see him. How to listen. Not to what I want to hear, but to what he's actually saying. Lila smiled. It's not complicated. You just have to stop trying to fix everything and start being present. She reached for his hand and placed it flat against her throat. Feel that? She hummed, low and steady. The vibration traveled through his palm. Victor nodded. That's how I first connected with Rowan. Not through words or signs. Through feeling. Sometimes the best way to communicate isn't talking. It's just being there. Steady. Trustworthy. Victor closed his eyes, feeling the hum resonate under his hand, and understood. Over the following weeks, the estate became a laboratory of sound and discovery. Rowan learned to identify the fountain by its hiss, the wind chimes by their metallic shimmer, the refrigerator by its low hum. Lila created sensory maps, drawings that paired images with textures and sounds. Rain was a drawing of drops, a piece of sandpaper for texture, and a recording of a storm. Laughter was a stick figure smile, soft cotton, and a clip of Rowan's own giggles played back. One afternoon, Rowan tugged Lila's sleeve and led her to the garden. He pointed to the hedge maze and signed, "What sound?" Lila tilted her head, listening. "The leaves. Hear how they rustle? That's the wind talking to the trees." Rowan closed his eyes and stood very still, his face serious with concentration. Then he opened his eyes and signed, like whispers. Lila's heart swelled. "Yes, baby, exactly like whispers." At night, Lila and Rowan developed a ritual. They would sit in the foyer, the room that once swallowed sound, and hum back and forth, call and response, their voices resonating off the hard floors and high ceilings. Victor would stand in the doorway, watching, learning the language of presence. On a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the press conference, a certified letter arrived at the estate. Victor opened it in his office. Lila sat across from him, a mug of tea cooling in her hands. He read in silence, his jaw tightening. "What is it?" Lila asked. Victor set the letter down. "The hospital's legal team. They're offering a settlement. $15 million. Full confidentiality agreement. Mutual non-disparagement clause." Lila frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means they'll pay me be quiet. To stop the audit. Withdraw the complaint. Shut down any public conversation about what happened. And if you don't..." Victor picked up the letter again, scanning the fine print. "They'll argue that my public statements constitute defamation, that I'm endangering their reputation without conclusive proof of systemic negligence." Lila set down her tea. "What are you going to do?" Victor looked at her, then out the window where Rowan was chasing a butterfly across the lawn, laughing at the sound of his own footsteps on gravel. "I'm going to refuse," he said simply. "I'm choosing noise over silence. The right kind." Lila smiled. "Good." Victor called his attorney and dictated a response on the spot. "Mr. Langford declines the settlement offer. The Open Ear Initiative will proceed as planned, and all findings from the independent audit will be made publicly available. Transparency is not negotiable." When he hung up, Lila reached across the desk and squeezed his hand. "Rowan's lucky to have you," she said. Victor shook his head. "No, I'm lucky to have both of you." That night, as the sun set over the estate, Rowan sat at the piano, picking out the melody Victor had taught him. Lila stood beside him, humming harmony. And Victor, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, realized something profound. For the first time in 10 years, his house wasn't quiet because it was empty. It was full of sound, of life, of the kind of love that didn't need to be perfect, just present. Outside, the first stars appeared. Inside, a family, stitched together not by blood or money, but by courage and attention, began to heal. 3 months after the press conference, the state medical board convened a public hearing in a packed courthouse in downtown Chicago. The gallery was filled with journalists, medical professionals, parents of children with undiagnosed conditions, and advocates from disability rights organizations. Victor sat in the front row beside Lila, his hand resting on the armrest between them. Behind them, Dr. Patel sat with a box of files on her lap, the complete audit trail she compiled over weeks of late nights and career risk. At the defendant's table, Dr. Halverson sat flanked by 2 attorneys, his face composed but drawn. The hospital's legal team had tried to settle 3 times. Victor had refused each offer. The board chair, a gray-haired woman with steel-rimmed glasses, called the hearing to order. "This inquiry concerns the case of Rowan Langford, patient ID 447-29B, and allegations of systemic negligence in the diagnosis and treatment of foreign body ear canal obstruction over a 10-year period." She looked directly at Dr. Halverson. "Dr. Halverson, you reviewed the audit findings. Do you dispute the timeline as presented?" Halverson cleared his throat. "The timeline is accurate. However, I would argue that medical decision-making often involves balancing multiple variables. Did you or did you not, the chair interrupted, receive a memo dated April 14th, 2022, flagging an atypical canal shadow and recommending follow-up imaging? Silence. Yes, Halverson said quietly. And did you pursue that follow-up? The memo was deemed low priority based on the patient's existing diagnostic profile. That's not what I asked, the chair said. Did you pursue follow-up imaging? Halverson looked down. No. A murmur swept through the gallery. The chair turned to the screen behind her, where an email was projected in large text. Patient classified VIP. Recommend we avoid alarming language in reports. Suggest we monitor via existing protocol. Doctor, can you explain why a VIP classification would influence clinical judgment? Halverson's attorney leaned in, whispering. Halverson shook his head. I wanted to maintain continuity of care. The family had expressed frustration with inconclusive findings. I believe stability was in the patient's best interest. Stability, the chair repeated, or profitability? The attorney stood. Objection. That's inflammatory. Overruled. This is an inquiry, counselor, not a courtroom. Sit down. The attorney sat. The chair opened another file. The audit shows that Rowan Langford's case generated an average of $420,000 annually in billable services, consultations, therapies, experimental protocols, all coded under a permanent impairment classification that made him eligible for sponsored research programs tied to your department's funding. She looked at Halverson over her glasses. If the foreign body had been discovered and removed in 2022, that revenue stream would have ended. Correct. Halverson's face went pale. I never thought of it that way. Then think now, the chair said, because a 10-year-old boy spent 3 additional years in silence because no one wanted to disrupt the narrative. She turned to the board. I'm recommending a 6-month suspension of Dr. Halverson's license, pending remedial ethics training, mandatory reporting of this case to the National Practitioner Databank, and a full institutional review of VIP patient protocols at the hospital. She looked out at the gallery. And I'm mandating that the hospital fund the implementation of the Open Ear Initiative's red flag protocols across all pediatric departments statewide. The room erupted in applause. 6 weeks later, the Open Ear Initiative launched its first mobile clinic in a rural town 3 hours south of Chicago. The clinic was set up in a high school gymnasium. Folding tables, portable screening equipment, and bins of brightly colored training kits Lila had designed herself. Parents lined up with children in tow. Teachers brought students flagged for hearing difficulties. Community health workers arrived with notebooks and questions. Lila stood at the intake table, greeting each family with a smile that made them feel seen. A mother approached, holding the hand of a small boy, maybe 6 years old, who kept tilting his head to one side and rubbing his ear. He's been doing this for weeks, the mother said, her voice tight with worry. The clinic said it was probably wax buildup, but I saw your story, and I thought... You thought you'd check, Lila finished gently. That's exactly right. Let's take a look. She led the boy to a screening station where a trained aide, a former school nurse Lila had personally mentored, examined his ear canal with an otoscope. The aide's expression shifted. Lila, can you come here? Lila looked. There, lodged deep in the canal, was a dark, segmented shadow, nearly identical to what she'd seen in Rowan's ear. Her pulse quickened, but her voice stayed calm. Okay, we're going to get this out safely. Mom, come hold his hand. The extraction took less than 5 minutes. The creature, a small beetle, came free with a careful, steady pull using the sterile forceps from the training kit. The boy gasped, blinked, and then turned toward his mother's voice. Mommy, he said, his eyes wide with shock. I can hear you. The mother burst into tears, pulling her son into her arms. Lila stepped back, her own eyes wet, and whispered, One more, Mateo. One more saved. By the end of the day, the clinic had screened 47 children. 3 were referred for immediate follow-up. 1, a 7-year-old girl, had a foreign body removed on-site, restoring partial hearing within minutes. That night, Lila called Victor from her hotel room. It works, she said, her voice shaking with exhaustion and joy. The protocols work. We're finding them. Victor's voice came through warm and proud. You're finding them. I'm just writing the checks. No, Lila said firmly. You're opening doors. That matters. Back at the estate, life had settled into a new rhythm, one measured not in silence, but in sound. Rowan's vocabulary grew daily. He learned words like symphony, whisper, thunder, and his favorite, laughter. Victor had stepped back from most of his corporate obligations, delegating deals he once would have controlled personally. Instead, he attended Rowan's speech therapy sessions, sat in the second row at Open Ear Initiative community events, and learned to listen more than he spoke. One Saturday morning, Rowan tugged Victor's sleeve and led him to the reflecting pool, the same place where Lila had performed the extraction months earlier. Rowan pointed to the fountain. "Dad, listen," he said, his words still slightly slurred but clear with intent. Victor knelt beside him. "What do you hear?" "Music," Rowan said. He closed his eyes. "Water music." Victor's throat tightened. "Yes, that's exactly what it is." Rowan opened his eyes and placed a small hand against Victor's chest, just as Lila had taught him. "Your heart." "Music, too." Victor pulled his son close, tears streaming freely. "You hear that?" Rowan nodded. "Always." That evening, as the sun set and painted the state in shades of amber and rose, the three of them, Victor, Lila, and Rowan, gathered in the foyer where sound now lived instead of died. Lila hummed a low note. Rowan harmonized above it. Victor, hesitant at first, added his voice below, a rumbling bass that made Rowan giggle. The sound filled the space, resonating off the high ceilings and hardwood floors, layering into something richer than any of them could create alone. When the hum faded, Rowan turned to his father and signed, then spoke aloud, "Dad, stay." Victor looked at him, confused. "I'm right here, buddy." Rowan shook his head. He pointed to the floor. "Here, stay. With me. With Lila. Stay." Understanding flooded Victor's face. His son wasn't asking him to remain in the room. He was asking him to remain present, to stop leaving, emotionally, physically, into deals and distance and the kind of control that had once felt like love. "I will," Victor whispered. He sat down on the floor, cross-legged, shoes still on, in the middle of the pristine foyer he'd once designed to repel life. Rowan climbed into his lap. Lila sat beside them, her hand resting on Rowan's shoulder, and they stayed. As the light shifted from gold to violet to deep blue, as the first stars appeared outside the tall windows, as the house, for the first time in its existence, learned to hold sound not as an enemy but as a gift. 1 year later, the Langford estate hosted its first Open Ear Initiative gala. Not in a hotel ballroom, but in the mansion itself. The foyer was filled with people, donors, families who'd been helped by the clinics, medical professionals committed to reform, and children. So many children, running and laughing and filling the space with joyful noise. Rowan, now 11, played piano in the music room for an audience that included his speech therapist, Dr. Patel, and the mother whose son had the first child helped at the mobile clinic. Victor stood at the podium, no longer the man who controlled narratives, but the man who'd learned to let truth speak for itself. "A year ago," he began, "this house worshipped silence. We believed quiet was the same as peace. We were wrong." He gestured to Lila, who stood beside him and addressed the color of sunlight. "Ms. Duarte taught us that silence can be a cage, and that the loudest truth sometimes comes from the smallest voice or the smallest creature." On the wall behind him, enlarged and framed, was a photograph, the arthropod that had been removed from Rowan's ear, preserved and mounted, with a plaque that read, "Attention is the first medicine." To date, Victor continued, the Open Ear Initiative has screened over 12,000 children across 8 states. We've identified 47 cases of foreign body obstruction that were missed by traditional systems. 47 children who can now hear. The room erupted in applause. "But numbers don't tell the whole story," Victor said, his voice softening. "The story is in the moments. A mother hearing her son say, 'I love you,' for the first time. A teacher watching a student finally respond to her voice. A father," he paused, overcome. A father learning that the greatest thing he can build isn't a fortune. It's presence. Lila stepped to the microphone. "We started with one child and one stubborn maid who wouldn't look away," she said, smiling. "Now we're a movement, and we're just getting started." She raised her glass. "To every child who's been overlooked, to every parent who trusted their instincts, and to the truth that sometimes the best medicine isn't the most expensive, it's the most attentive." To attention, the room echoed. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the caterers had cleared the last of the champagne flutes, Victor found Rowan and Lila sitting by the reflecting pool under a sky crowded with stars. Rowan was tracing constellations with his finger, naming them aloud. Orion, Big Dipper, Cassiopeia. Victor sat down beside them, letting his expensive shoes rest in the damp grass. "Dad," Rowan said, turning to him, "do stars make sound?" Victor smiled. "I don't know. What do you think?" Rowan considered this seriously. "I think everything makes sound, even quiet things. You just have to listen the right way." Lila looked at Victor, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Wise kid," she whispered. Victor reached out and took her hand, no longer as an employer, but as a partner, a friend, a family member chosen not by blood, but by shared purpose and love. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing him, for seeing us." Lila squeezed his hand. "Thank you for letting me stay." Rowan nestled between them, his head on Lila's shoulder, his hand in his father's. And above them, the stars turned in their ancient courses, silent to most but singing to those who knew how to listen. The mansion, once a mausoleum of control and quiet, had become a home, not perfect, not silent, but alive. And in the foyer, where sound now danced instead of died, a small plaque hung beside the framed photograph of the creature that had changed everything. Rowan Langford spoke his first word here, not because of money, not because of medicine, but because someone refused to look away. May we all learn to see what others miss, and hear what silence tries to hide. The house had learned to hold sound, and the sound it held most carefully was love. 3 years later, the Open Ear Initiative operates 23 mobile clinics across North America. Dr. Patel serves as medical director. Lila Duarte has trained over 400 community health workers and published the first peer-reviewed protocol for non-specialist foreign body detection. Victor Langford sits on the board but spends most of his time coaching youth soccer and attending Rowan's piano recitals. Rowan, now 14, is learning 3 languages and volunteers at initiative clinics, translating his experience into hope for other children. The arthropod that started it all remains in the foyer, a testament to the truth that sometimes the smallest things carry the biggest lessons. Pay attention, look closely, and never, ever stop listening. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment telling me which moment made you cry. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories of courage, hope, and miracles that money can't buy. Hit that like button if you believe that sometimes the smallest voice carries the biggest truth. See you in the next one.